Okay, so our next speaker, Nuno Correia, is an associate professor in digital transformation at Tallinn University. And he has been teaching and conducting research in media art and interaction design at several colleges across the world since 2000. Nuno is an associate researcher as well at the Interactive Technology Institute in Portugal, and he's also the founder of the Sound, Image, and Interaction Design Symposium. The talk today will be about audiovisual interfaces.
So the concept of audiovisual interfaces links interaction, sound, and image, building upon the traditional graphical user interfaces. So using sonic and visual feedback when reacting to user interactions, audiovisual interfaces can actually lead to more usable, playful, and captivating UIs, particularly where accessibility and engagement are very important. So please give a round of applause to Nuno Correia.
Hi, Dan. So my name is Nuno Correia. As was mentioned, I'm associate professor in digital transformation at Tallinn University. So I just joined, actually. I'm here for 2 months only, so it's a pleasure to be here. So this presentation will be a bit more artistic and speculative than the previous ones. So please bear with me, and I hope this is an adequate prelude to lunch, which will follow soon. So we live in a multisensory world. So we are constantly bombarded by different sensory stimuli. So we all remember walking by the seaside, walking down a pier, and we are bombarded by these sensory impressions. We hear the sound of the waves. We see this turmoil of sea ahead of us. We are splashed, maybe, with drops of water. We feel the wind. And this is very, very pleasurable, I imagine, and very stimulating. When we are presented with other type of experiences which are not multisensorial, like this image here, our brain can fill in the gaps, especially if we have previous experiences related to that. So when we see this image, memories are evoked of other senses that are not present here. So maybe sounds are evoked, maybe smells or haptic impressions. This phenomena has been studied by psychologists for many years. So for example, in the end of the 1920s, a psychologist called Wolfgang Kohler came up with this test, which is the Kiki-Buba test. Recently, I found out that Kohler was actually born in Tallinn, so this is a quite interesting coincidence. So what is the Kiki-Buba test? So the Kiki-Buba test is you present to participants this image with these two figures, and you ask participants which of these is Buba and which of these is Kiki. And surprisingly enough, the vast majority, so we're talking about 90%, answer that the left one is Kiki and the right one is Buba. And this test has been conducted in many cultures across the years, in many parts of the world, across many different groups with different levels of literacy, and the answer is consistent. This tells us something, that our brain creates this consistent associations between sound and image, right? And this is really interesting because we as designers, we can leverage that. If the brain creates these associations, maybe we can create new meaning if we combine sound and image. So artists know this well. So this has been quite well explored in art. So artists, even if artists work with one modality, they leverage other senses through that modality. So film theoretician Michel Chion states that when kinetic sensations organized into art are transmitted through a single sensory channel, they can convey all the other senses at once. So Michel Chion is a theoretician, he's also a composer. And he gives the example of the inherent sounds you hear in silent movies. So this is the Dziga Vertov Man with a Movie Camera, still from that movie. And he also mentions the latent visuality in musique concrète, that when you listen to this kind of music, images are evoked as well. So this is quite powerful. But in the 20th century, we've gone, in some media, we've gone a different way. We've dissociated the visual and the audio to a certain extent. So with the emergence of radio, TV, and the mechanical reproduction of media in the 20th century, some media have become dissociated in terms of their multisensoriality. For example, music. Back in the old days, you used to experience music with performance, right? So you'd go to a performance to listen to music, but you're not just listening, you're watching the performers and probably feeling the impressions of the room, etc. So it was very multisensorial experience. But with vinyl, CDs, so mechanically reproduced music, you lose that element, that visual element. Sure, you have the packaging, which kind of bridges that gap, but you have a big multisensory gap by having it as a commodified as an object and not as an experience, which is more multisensorial. This didn't get better with the years, right? So in the end of the 20th century and the beginning of this century, there were more waves of digitization that even dissolved this kind of physical element of the product even more to a more abstract entity of a MP3 file or a streaming service. And we know that this continues, right? So streaming services have increased in popularity and adoption 20 to 30% for the last few years. Well, the problem is not just there, it's also how we consume interactive media and how we consume digital services, etc. Quite often is with mobile devices in social contexts that are not really adequate for sound, right? So it inhibits the use of sound. And where are we going next, right? With talks of metaverse and the growth of VR and AR, etc. Are we going to become sensorially desensitized, that we're only going to focus on the visual and remove everything else? So what can we do to invert that? If we agree that this is a problem, we might succumb to the power of the visual. But if we agree this is a problem, how can we invert this process? So this is something that I've been exploring as a researcher, as a media artist for the past 15 years. And I'll give you an example of one of my works, actually it's 11 years old now, but still provides an indication of what can be done, I guess, with a more multisensorial approach to media. So this example is called AV Clash, and it's a web net art piece that allows to navigate the freesound.org sound database. I don't know if you're familiar with that, but it's a really useful, interesting database of sound organized by Universitat Pompeu Fabra in Barcelona. And you access sounds with Creative Commons license. You can download sounds, you can upload sounds. But if you've been to that website, I mean, it's a typical website where you have menu systems and a lot of text and some sound thumbnails. And I wanted to have a more playful way to interact with it and to navigate those sounds, right? So let's have an audiovisual experience of 30 seconds. I'll play a little video of AV Clash.
Yeah, we don't.
Okay. So this was 2010, 2011. Since then, I've been interested in this kind of combination of UI elements with sound and image and combining interaction design with audiovisual design. And I wanted to enable artists, designers, practitioners to create this kind of audiovisual experience, interactive audiovisual experiences more easily. And to do that, I worked at that point I was living in London, so I worked in London with a group of audiovisual artists and designers. So we had a co-design process where we created a toolkit to easily generate user interfaces that combined visualization of interaction with sonification of interaction in a coherent way. And we called it audiovisual user interfaces. So audiovisual interfaces is the toolkit, the software toolkit, but it's also a concept which links interaction, sound and image, building upon the concept of graphical user interface by adding interconnected audio and visual feedback to interaction. So in a recent article I wrote, I was trying to map audiovisual interfaces with related fields, and I felt that that could add to this conversation today. So I map audiovisual user interfaces as being in the confluence of HCI, and in particular graphical user interfaces, sonic interaction design, in particular the concepts of auditory icons and ear cons, we'll talk about it a bit later, cognitive psychology and cross-modal interaction, which relates to the Kiki-Booba effect that we talked about earlier, and audiovisual art, and specifically the tools that practitioners use to create audiovisual art. About the GUI, that's probably something we're all familiar with. We know that the pioneers in the 60s, such as Ivan Sutherland and Douglas Engelbart, really set the scene for graphical user interfaces. And these were further developed in other labs, such as Xerox Spark by people like Alan Kay in the 70s. And then, of course, Steve Jobs, Apple, they took it into a viable commercial product, leveraging graphical user interfaces with the Mac, and before that with the Apple Lisa in '84. So sound designers were not far behind. So they were actually inspired by the emergence of graphical user interfaces, and they wanted to bring sound to this kind of stimulating world of the graphical operating systems, right? And there were all these icons coming into scene, right? All this kind of very graphical atmosphere, which was very different from the command line of ancient days. So the field of sonic interaction design emerged. And I'll read you the quote from the book Sonic Interaction Design, which defines what it is. So this is a book by MIT Press. I have the references later in an end slide. So Sonic Interaction Design explores ways in which sound can be used to convey information, meaning, and aesthetic and emotional qualities in interactive contexts. This is quite interesting because, normally we think of sound as something that is aesthetic and emotional, right? We agree with that. But sound can also be used to convey information and meaning, and that's very useful for us as designers, right? But there is a warning, right? In order to foster an embodied experience, and this relates to multisensoriality as well, both the interface and its sonic behavior must be carefully designed. So we cannot just add sounds as a kind of a coating in the end to the interface. You need to consider them together and integrate them well. And for that, there's a whole new set of theories that come with sonic interaction design that any designer that wants to implement these kind of approaches should be aware of. And examples of these approaches are auditory icons and ear cons. So these are approaches that try to be the sonic equivalent of graphical icons, right? But with different kind of, one is a bit more skeuomorphic, auditory icons, and other a lot more abstract, ear cons. Bill Gaver, that came up with the concept of auditory icons, actually later went on to collaborate with Apple to create the Sonic Finder in the late 80s. So these things are quite interrelated. Now, let's talk a little bit more about psychology and cross-modal interaction. So the field of cognitive psychology has been exploring this phenomena of cross-modal interaction. There's all these kind of interesting effects, like the Kiki-Booba, that happen in our brain with different modalities emerge, and specifically sound and image, which is the topic of this talk. So what is cross-modal interaction? It's the phenomena by which information from one sensory modality influences the processing of signals from another modality. So we saw the Kiki-Booba effect. On the right, on the image there, you have another famous kind of audio-visual cross-modal interaction effect called the McGurk effect. And what is the McGurk effect? The McGurk effect is when you hear something. So, for example, you hear the sound APA, but you're seeing something different. You're seeing the lips moving, producing the sound aka. You don't hear aka, you hear appa, you see lips moving, saying aka. You don't hear appa, actually. All of a sudden, you hear ata. So your eyes can trick your ears, right? And that's what the McGurk effect says. There's a lot of this. I love this stuff. So there's a lot of these interesting anecdotes and interesting cross-modal effects. And we as designers can use them, right? If we are fluent with these tools and with these concepts, we can use it to really interesting effects. And guess what? There are a lot of designers now looking into this. And there's an emerging field of multisensory UX. There's a recent book on the topic. It was launched less than a year ago, if I remember. And what is multisensory UX? It's the study of experiences designed with the senses, especially multiple senses, of course, sight, hearing, touch, taste, smell, in mind, which can be enabled through existing and emerging technologies. Lastly, in this kind of Venn diagram of mine that we're going kind of counterclockwise, we have audiovisual art, right? And my point here, also I'm a little bit biased because I'm an artist myself, is that artists can bring a lot to this discussion. Why? Because they are very fluent with using senses as a tool, right? As a raw material to convey emotion and to convey engagement. Especially audiovisual artists that are really adept at combining sound and image in a very coherent way, can tell us a lot how to design these systems. That's why I went through this co-design process with them. And so I tried to have them share knowledge with us, with our design team. And also, once I created the AVUI toolkit, I gave it back to them so that they could create systems of their own with it. And they stress tested it. So they're kind of power users, right? They're power users, they're expert users of combination of sound and image. And they're also power users because they really need very reliable systems to use in their very demanding environments, which are real-time performance in front of large audiences and things like that, so that the systems cannot fail, or should not fail. One interesting thing is that audiovisual artists are also very DIY people, or do-it-yourself people, because tools, there are no real specific tools for audiovisual design or audiovisual art. So there are really a lot of tools to make music or to make film, and they do have, the music tools do have some visual aspects, and the video tools do have some sound aspects, but they don't treat them equally. There's no parity, and those tools are biased towards one of the modalities. So there's no real equal tool for that. That's why we developed this toolkit, right? So let's summarize. So AVUIs allow to combine this kind of icon-based, so the objective, and hopefully we succeeded in that, is that AVUI is allowed to combine this icon-based approach of the auditory icons and ear cons and actually add a reactive visual element to them. So we can create this kind of audiovisual icons out of it. So they've passed the test of reliability with these audiovisual artists, and they've integrated their expertise in the loop. So we organize actually quite a few number of workshops and hackathons and performances with these tools. And one thing that when take away from evaluation of these systems is that it can assist in terms of speed of development and of systems for audiovisual scenarios, performances, and others. So the toolkit that we developed, it's a C++ toolkit. I hope we could adapt it to other languages, and it's available on GitHub for download. This is an example of a few AVUIs, or three kind of very simple. I mean, they're not very fancy, but you get an idea. So there are UI zones with typical GUI elements such as buttons, toggles, XY pads, sliders. No forms here, but we can think of an audiovisual form maybe for the future. What you don't see here is there's inherent sound when you interact with them, and there's a visualization of the interaction and of the sound. So this is very new. and we can discuss now what can be use cases for this. I don't think, I'm not an evangelist of AVUIs that we need to use AVUIs in everything. The forms thing was a joke, right? So we don't need to use this for everything. What can be useful for? One thing we've been using it for is games. So this is a game we did called Shape Tones. And you may say some resemblance to good old Kiki Booba here, right? And we use this kind of Gestalt psychology strategies to create these sound-to-image mappings that's behind Kiki Booba. So we can speculate that, well, this is something tested. We actually have a paper on this on a major HCI conference. We have a major paper on AVUIs on the same conference. And that's about it in terms of where we are with this research. It's quite new. We speculate that, you know, I talked about metaverse just now, but with this kind of highly immersive scenarios, do we want them to be only visual, or do we want to bring other senses in the mix? And if we want, what is the rule book for that, right? How can we bring sound and image in a coherent way together? And I think there's an interesting discussion to be had about that. How do we integrate interfaces in that mix, right? My co-writer in the Shape Tones paper went on to really develop this in the side of accessibility and has many papers on that. I didn't follow that path, but he gladly did. We actually did some early tests with visually impaired children with Shape Tones. This was in Bristol in the UK, but he really pursued that further. So I think there's a lot of potential there also for accessibility. Why? Because if we convey information in an integrated way via the auditory channel and the visual channel, there's a redundancy there that really makes the conveying of information more robust and more reliable. So if you have an impairment in one of the sensory signals, you get reinforcement from the other signal, right? But again, more research is needed, and I'm happy to hear your ideas on this and how these systems can be made more useful. So these are the references. I'm afraid the type might be a little bit small, but feel free to ask me, and I hope this will be made available, these presentations. So thank you very much, and these are my contacts, and I'm eager to hear your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nuno. Here's a gift from our team. Are there any questions in the audience? Raise your hand and let us know.
We do have one question that has popped up in the Q&A section. So someone is asking, what are your thoughts on the new emerging audioverse with Clubhouse and podcasts?
I am not really an expert on that. I'm not so much of a podcast enthusiast myself. I'm really audiovisual, so I really like to have the video and the other. So my thoughts are those that I lack the visual engagement with those tools, right? But I think there's a lot of potential there. This is out of the blue. I haven't given it too much thought. But there's a lot of potential there to have kind of real-time captioning and kind of some semantic analysis and kind of to add some kind of visual element there that is not merely automatic captioning, which there could be some AI visual content being generated. It's like some intelligent slideshow creation behind it that could make it a bit more audiovisual. And then I would watch them, consume
Awesome,
them
thank
more.
you.
Those are my thoughts. Yeah.